Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me in another of my wonderful interviews. Now we're going to go into a subject here that I know very little about. I heard a lot about, and I think for a while, and I don't know if it's still the case, that the government has been trying to sort of eradicate because I think they don't understand it, and they're in with big pharma and they want you to pop the pills that these big manufacturers want to do. And this is homeopathy. I want to find out all about it, why it is that it works so well and why people are actually raving about it. So today I'm bringing to you the lovely lady called Caroline Gaskin, who is, it's written down here, a homeopath, a holistic health coach and a flower essence prescriber. Going to find out what that is. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thanks. So nice to be here and great to talk to someone who knows nothing about a subject that you spend 24/7 immersed in.
Well, I do know I mean, the journey that I've been on the last year of exploring all of this has been absolutely fantastic. And I'm slowly beginning to learn what an amazing alternative there is to the pill popping world of big pharma and the GP who's only got 2 or 3 minutes to see you. So this has been really great. And I'm actually, I feel so much better myself. Not that I've been terribly ill, but just on the fact that there are all these other options to me if something befalls me. So, and I know one of the subjects that we were speaking at before we recorded, you said you want to talk about how people come to alternative health. And I think that would be a great place to start because a lot of people are in that position now where they can't get appointments and they're thinking, what should I do? And there is perhaps a daunting task to go to so many different alternatives that they suddenly meet. So, yeah. But first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got into the things that you do.
Yeah, thank you. I'd always had an interest in health, and I didn't, obviously, you don't always realize that at first, but
Mm.
we used to get the Reader's Digest. Do you remember that?
Oh, my goodness, yes.
Yeah, so that
Used to
dropped
love it.
through exactly. That was a fountain of knowledge. It dropped through the door. And I remember me reading two articles. One was about how sugar was bad for you. And that was a bit of a shock because I was something of a sugar addict, like most kids of
Yes.
the 1970s. I ate sugar with chemicals and colouring in. I thought it was fantastic, blackjacks and all the other ones, fruit salads.
Oh,
So
fruit
that,
salad. Yes.
yeah, that's what I spent my pocket
I
money
used to
on.
love those.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and I wrote about this the other day. Actually, I was disappointed when my pocket money went from sixpence, which seemed like a lot, to two and a half pence, which seemed like nothing. Do you remember
Mm.
that?
What, in decimalisation?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
felt
suddenly
really
you,
shortchanged.
yeah. And you could get a lot for sixpence. And it was great when sixpence arrived, and because you'd eaten too many blackjacks and fruit salads and your teeth had fallen out, the tooth fairy would come and put that sixpence under the pillow. 2.5 pence
Totally.
didn't seem the same.
It's true, and also, what did the dentists do in the 1970s? They
Yeah.
filled your mouth with mercury. So
Yes.
that's another topic we could spend probably rather too long talking about and
Yeah.
seeking solutions. So I came into it. I kind of had a latent interest in health, but art was my career, and that was what I was bowling along doing. And then, quite young, I had children, or we had children, and suddenly I was responsible for someone else's health. And I started to ask questions. And when my son had a cough, I went to the doctor, and the doctor said, take this medication. And it had a sedative in it. And being something of a kind of art school punk, I was like, I'm not drugging my baby. What are you
Mm.
talking about? And at that point, I went to look for something else. And I was thinking about this before we spoke. I wish I could remember who it was who said to me, why don't you go and see this homeopath at a drop-in clinic? I had no idea what that was, but I just knew I didn't want to give my baby drugs. And I went to
Mm.
see this woman, and it was just probably a 15-minute drop-in appointment. So, kind of introductory space, really, just to focus on the cough. But she asked me, he was 4 months old, and she asked me all sorts of questions about him and about how the cough was for him. And I was fascinated by that. She didn't just say, here, put your baby to sleep so he doesn't cough at night with this drug. She
Mm.
wanted to know much more about him and how he showed up in the world. And she gave me a remedy and it worked. So that was that was great. And after a while, that just became our first point of call when we needed, support. And one day, so this is something. This sort of tells you a little bit about the kind of journey, I suppose. I was probably about 4.5 months into parenting, and I lost weight, the pregnancy weight, quite quickly. And I went back to, I didn't realize this. You don't always see these things for yourself, which is why it is good to have the context of a group or a practitioner at times. But I couldn't see that I'd gone back in the process of breastfeeding and looking after baby to below my pre pregnancy weight. And I was a little bit undernourished. And I started to kind of feel a bit disorientated. And in fact, what was going on is it was affecting my blood sugar. And I must have said something to her because she said, I think you need to come and see me as well. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went in to see her for a session, not just my son.
Mm.
And she she gave me this remedy that I always say kind of got to the bottom of the barrel of who Caroline Gaskin was and made me look at things that I'd never really looked at in my life. It was like a kind of 180, and I was able to see some of the patterns and some of the things that I was doing and start to make much more informed choices about the world and how I navigated it. Because I think for many of us, we trust the setting in which we've grown up, which for the vast majority of us is mainstream medicine. And we're in that till we're 16. And we don't know that age 16 we can actually make health choices ourselves. So it usually really crops up once you leave home,
Right.
and
Yeah.
you start to you start to kind of ask somebody for support, And I just to go back to the dentist, I remember going to the dentist once, and he looked in my mouth. I had some kind of, I don't know, rash or lesion or something going on. And he sort of called in a load of colleagues to look in my mouth, which was a bit unnerving, but didn't really give me any solutions. And I think,
Right.
that kind of solutions
Yeah.
orientated
And then left
space
you to
is
fend for yourself after loads of people
exactly,
had had a good gawp in your gob. That's nice, isn't it?
exactly, exactly. So I guess, by a process of experiencing something and seeing that it had great results, I stuck with that and eventually moved into training. But that's sort of another story, really.
What immediately comes to me from what you've just said is the fact that the practitioner that you went to see, the homeopath, asked you lots of questions,
Yeah,
and whereas the GP, hassled by time and all of that, who has, those certain remedies they know they're going to get a bit of a backhander on if they promote those more than anything else, but I say wistfully, but they don't give you that time. And
no,
and as a patient coming in slightly nervous, especially with a baby, the fact that I mean, that's so reassuring in and of itself that somebody's actually taking the time to ask you questions that perhaps you haven't even thought of yourself.
absolutely. And often what happens in an appointment is you are asking those questions. And I say to people, there's plenty of time to ask me questions too. But
Mm.
it kind of unfolds and unpacks, your story about how you arrived to that point, whether you're 6 months, 60, or moving into really old age. It's like there is always a story, a narrative. There are always points at which you took a different decision for some reason, and that could be emotional, that could be through physical trauma, it could be through you don't recover properly from an illness, but something that takes you below par when you then make a different choice. So to have somebody kind of help you reflect on that journey and begin to understand the pattern, that you've
Mm.
the course of life, and how you could be supported. I think a lot of things come up from that. You might look back and think regretfully, or I didn't deal with a certain situation well. If I had had more tools at my disposal, would I have dealt with
Mm.
it differently? And it's just something to be said for experience, but the school of hard knocks isn't the only way to learn.
No, no, but as you say, I would imagine that everybody has those made decisions where now they reflect, God, if I know now what I knew, if I knew now what I didn't know then, You know what I'm trying to say. So tell us about homeopathy, because there was this sort of feeling that it was being poo-pooed by the so-called approved medical
Yeah,
profession and ousted. And as growing up, it always was in my background, maybe because people were doing it, and I never really understood it because I never, did anything. But the essence was you take a little bit of the poison and it actually makes you better, sort of thing. Is how it was
yeah.
sold to me.
Yeah, that in itself is true. It's so interesting that you grew up with that in your background. I didn't at all. I came from very kind of both my parents were scientists. They came from creating some of the chemicals and things that I'm kind of rally against now, and I'm
All
trying
right.
to find
So
solutions
your
for.
parents are responsible then, are they? They'll go
Yeah,
and get
to
them.
some extent, exactly. Like they develop plastics, and so
Oh, right.
so that's really interesting, I think, to come from that background and to be, to looking at the world from a different perspective. But necessarily in that scientific space, that research space, you're asking a lot of questions. And I
Mm.
sometimes feel, particularly through COVID, that I am a walking question box, that I'm continually asking questions. But to come back to what you asked, I suppose my own experience of homeopathy was simply that it worked. It was a choice that I made on the basis of somebody saying, "Why don't you do this?" Because it worked for me, and I
Mm.
and I went to see a practitioner. And I think that is true for an awful lot of people. I think an awful lot of people that come into homeopathy are women who are making choices about their health because there isn't actually a lot of support for women's health problems, or they are bringing children into the world and they're like, oh, I asking some questions exactly as I did. Very, very common for women to be told during pregnancy, oh, there's no solution. And so you look outside of the mainstream for something that will help reach, your pain point.
Mm.
And so homeopathy itself, I mean, there's a story of why it's got such bad rap in the West, I'm going to say, because, yes, I don't know, I can't remember what the stat is, something like how many people live in India? Is it about 50 million use homeopathy as a matter of course? In,
Right.
in
Gosh.
Germany, yeah, exactly. In Germany, a Heilpraktiker, which is a health practitioner, is trained in homeopathy, acupuncture, um, nutrition as well as mainstream medicine. So this kind of drive has come from certainly England, but I mean originally it came in 2005. So I graduated in 2000, launched into practice, loved it, successful, and then 2005 the World Health Organization. I'm just going to mention them, bring it back to them. They discovered or did a survey and announced that homeopathy was the second most popular form of health choice in the world.
Oh, I see. And they didn't
Yeah,
like that
they didn't like that. So this
because they're not
predates.
making any money out of it, or at least
Well,
their
yeah,
sponsors, I suppose, are not making money.
yeah, and there are some people that make money out of it. There are many homeopathic, drug manufacturers, and then there are all
Mm.
the attendant, colleges and businesses and pharmacies, etc. But nothing like, big pharma in terms of that scale. And then, the other thing that really comes out of that is when you've got a massive threat and you've got finance, you've got a lot of resources to do something about it. And
Yes.
I remember a subsequent boyfriend saying to me, why don't you guys do something about it? And I said, well, we do have, the Homeopathic Research Institute. We do have like endless clinical studies that show that it works. And we'll talk a bit about what it is in a minute. But, we all that is available, but we know now how easy it is to ignore evidence, clinical
Yes.
evidence, and put it down. And we
Yes.
through COVID, I mean, we were given absolutely no solutions for what is an acute infectious disease. Every
Well,
single
the
thing
science is
was,
fixed, isn't it? The science is
it is
fixed. That's what
now.
they tell you.
Yeah.
They say, "Oh, no, no, no. We know the science. We know. You listen to us. Don't do your own research. Don't listen to anything else." We certainly saw all of that
Yeah.
during the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have looked at that and know instinctively that they've seen an article saying, well, vitamin B or D is going to be useful for this acute infectious disease, as it is for most acute
Mm.
infectious diseases of a lung nature. And then they're like, oh, I can't find that article anymore, and they're beginning to ask questions. So what we're seeing is a lot of people, particularly in other countries. So here we have, in the UK, we have the National Health Service to which we usually turn. But when you go to other countries that are kind of closer to their pioneer status, like New Zealand, Australia, and to some extent the States, and people live in much more rural communities, they have to have a resource right on their doorstep.
Mm.
So they're used to having home cures. Some cultures, some demographics are used to having home cures. Recently I did a talk on menopause and natural approaches to menopause for in Haringey, homes for Haringey, and the vast majority of the women in the audience were Afro-Caribbean, Eastern Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern. And many of them came forward afterwards and said, we don't necessarily make choices in our culture that are like HRT. We like to use some natural things. We had no idea that there was nothing available for menopause. So sometimes it's how we look at what a particular group of people are doing. And I'm being fascinated by many people turning towards homeopathy because you can have a small kit in your house to prescribe for fevers, headaches, coughs, colds, etc., etc. But to go into what homeopathy is, yes, it is a very diluted substance, and there is weirdly, and it does take your head, a little while to wrap around it, that the more you dilute a substance, the greater its sort of magnification is. And so we're seeing that we have that in science now. We have the studies that show us that water retains memory, for instance, that these micro, really micro, beyond nanoparticles have a conversation, and the system is listening to that. So
Wow.
your body is wow, and it has to really, you need to experience it to say, wow, that really worked for me. So to use an example, the boyfriend I mentioned earlier, he had a recurrent sore shoulder, and he would always kind of pull his muscle in a certain way. And I gave him a remedy from my kit and said, well, why don't you try this time instead of a painkiller? And it worked. And he was wowed by that, so that he could have something. The other thing to say about the cost of these things, one of the things that I try and talk about is that homeopathy in and of itself is a very low cost solution. It's very low environmental impact. So nobody yet is talking about the environmental impact of big pharma, of everything that it takes to
Mm.
create a pharmaceutical medication. I mean, literally all, if you want to talk about the pain and trauma in the labs, and I was thinking the other day that people are really beginning to smell a rat. And I was like, that's hilarious. All the rats. I was like, wow, we really are beginning to ask questions and seek solution about things that work for us as individuals. So, there are many forms. It's not just, I mean, obviously I practice homeopathy and that's the main thing that I do. But equally, I might be showing somebody that, spending time out in nature, learning to breathe properly, all these things can be factors that help you cope with something like anxiety. So there's lots of solutions. And although I sort of call myself a holistic health coach, it's like a container for all the
Mm.
things, that the knowledge that actually many of us hold. It's homeopathy. Sometimes I say it's like the icing on the cake. We also need to check in that we can absorb minerals efficiently, for instance, and vitamins efficiently in order to achieve optimum health. And that we might need to put, homeopathy can help us absorb those more efficiently, as can eating certain foods to diversify your gut flora. So that, there is this holistic approach. I'd never say to anybody, homeopathy is the panacea. I know we have that capacity to always search for the panacea. It can do amazing things for sure, and I've got 23 years of prescribing it and clinical evidence to talk about that. But the reality is we need to experience things for ourselves and know. People say things like, do you believe in homeopathy? I'm like, it's not a religion. I'm just observing that it works,
Yes.
and
So
I'm doing
let me
more of it.
right, right. So let me just go back to the fact that you're putting in a very very small part of some substance, whatever that is, a
Mhm,
sort of
mhm.
a non-healthy substance. Then I guess that the body will.
Sometimes, yeah,
Right.
sometimes. Mhm.
What was going through my mind is that we are in a soup at the moment of trace elements of all sorts of
Yeah,
dodgy stuff. So presumably, in a way, we're kind of using homeopathy without even having it prescribed, because we're taking in some sort of toxins and things at low level, sometimes higher level, of course. Is that also really working within us? And
it's a really
are we?
interesting question. Yeah, I'd love to see some studies of that to really, because most of us spend a lot of time trying to get certain toxins out of our life, and they
Mm,
usually occur in a much cruder way than, so the toxins in your water are much cruder than homeopathy. Yes, they're being diluted, but there's still an active physical trace. So when you use your water filter, for instance, you are taking actual, chemicals or substances, hormones, etc., out of your water. Whereas with what you've got with homeopathy, it's like an impression of that. It still holds the message, which is really phenomenal.
so
So
it's a purer form of whatever that
yeah,
toxin in if it is a toxin.
it's
Um,
massively diluted. I mean, to give
yeah,
to give an example of dilution, one drop of the original substance in a swimming pool equates to what we would call a very low potency remedy. So you're talking a massive dilution compared to, what is in your glass of water or not, depending
right.
on whether you filter it out.
So that
Um,
presumably is why a lot of people find it very difficult, because they say, well, how can something
yeah,
so incredibly diluted in a swimming pool make the blind bit of difference? When you think
exactly.
there could be
Yeah,
all sorts of other things in that swimming pool that might, on a
yeah,
bigger
yeah.
dosage, is going to affect you.
Exactly. There's another thing which happens with homeopathy in terms of the way we create a remedy is that it is shaken or succussed. So it is energized at each.
What does
It's
succust mean?
it means it's shaken like this, and that sounds like a little maraca or something, but that's me shaking a bottle of pills if you're listening. But
Hmm.
um, what you're doing by that is energizing it at each stage of its dilution. So it's not just you put a drop into the water and you dilute it. It is shaken or succussed, energized into at that level, and then you take one drop of that and dilute it again. So you've got this massive dilution to arrive at a very low strength remedy. And then we have much higher strength remedies, which we might prescribe for that more mental emotional prescription. So to talk about potency of a remedy, the strength of a remedy is relates to how much it has been diluted. So people might say, for something mental emotional, we might give a higher potency remedy. If something has affected somebody profoundly and they're moving into, and it sounds odd to talk about delusion, but a state where they believe that something is always going to happen to them. So that to me is a semi-delusional state. I believe I
Mm.
will never be loved, or I believe people say
Right.
things like, "I believe I'm going to get sick this winter." I'm like, really?
Yeah.
I'm a new parent,
Based
necessarily.
on
Yeah,
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 based on some sort of thing that they often get sick, and so it's a
yeah.
recurring pattern that they've almost convinced themselves that is going to happen.
Yeah, exactly, and that is the power of suggestion. And there's, you know, the self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, there's plenty of studies on that show us that if we believe something, then it's going to keep happening. And
Mm.
at that level, we would be usually giving somebody a higher dilution. It's like you're matching the intensity of that experience, whatever it is. And that, again, that said, that could be physical. So to give an example, I was working with a much older woman at one point. I was doing something called the Bates method, which is vision training to try and clear, like I don't know if you've come across that, but short
We did.
sightedness or long sight.
We had a chap
Yeah,
on talking about Dr. Bates,
it's
and
fascinating.
I've got a couple of book one of his Better Sight Without Glasses book, actually from the 1920s or whenever it was it
Yeah, I think
first
I've
came
got
out.
that too.
As you
But
can see, it works a treat with me.
it's brilliant, isn't it? Yeah. I've got inherent astigmatism, and if I do practice it, it does help. But there's yeah, it's you do need to practice it. Anyway, I was working with somebody, and I can't remember how we got into it. There was a part of the process which was reflection, which is an interesting thing when you look at vision, isn't it? That
Mm.
the capacity to reflect, and that was part of the process. And in that, she talked about a trauma, and I said, "Would you like me to give you a remedy?" And because that trauma had been a long time ago, in fact, she'd been driving, and they had a terrible accident, and they fell in the car down a cliff, and just
Oh
about
my
survived.
goodness!
I know,
And
and
survived.
exactly. And she said to me, she talked about the impact of that, and I gave her a remedy which
Not the literal impact of that. Falling down a
we
cliff.
probably did talk about the literal
Well,
impact, head
gosh.
injuries, etc. I mean, I was just
Yeah,
like, wow, there's so many kind of avenues that you can go down in terms
I
of
know.
so but the nature of car injuries compared to any other injuries, head injuries
Yes.
in a car are completely different to head injuries. I was listening to that Diary of a CEO when he talks about ADHD, and the guy
Right.
that he talks to is a brain guy, and he can't remember his official title, but basically he was talking about the impact of footballs, headers, boys doing headers and football injuries, and of course it's frontal cortex injury. And I was like, wow, I'd love to work with you and work with homeopathy and some of our brain injury remedies alongside what you're doing. So one day maybe we'll have this integrated health approach. But to come back to this beautiful old woman, she was easily in her late 80s, possibly early 90s. And I gave her a remedy called arnica, which is one of our number one remedies. And I gave it in a 1M, which is a high potency. And it was we would talk about prescribing that because it's sort of retrospective. This accident had happened like 30 years before, 40
Right.
years before. And so I was like, oh, we need that remedy to kind of reach back into the past and do some healing. So I gave her this remedy. And the next time I saw her, she said, that remedy was amazing. It's like she was feeling dizzy. She said, I no longer feel dizzy, and I've started to write my journal, my biography. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. She said, I just could not write about that period of my life because it was sort of wrapped up in not just that trauma, but the trauma of the relationship she'd been in at the time. And I was like, wow, that remedy kind of reached back somehow and enabled her to free up something so
That
that
is
she could
amazing.
deliver what she'd been wanting to deliver for years.
Yeah.
So
Gosh.
I mean, the more we can work with, wonderful healing opportunities like this, then the more I think ultimately we can call the shots because it takes back our power,
Mm.
and empowers us to want to support others as well. So I suppose my own kind of training, moving away from, an art career into doing this was something vocational came of like, people need to know about this stuff. It's
So
been
how?
hidden from us.
Yeah, yeah, like so many things. So,
Mm.
I mean, presumably there is, when somebody comes to you and they say, "Oh, I've got this headache, or I'm dizzy, or I've got aches and pains, or whatever it might be," and you ask all the relevant questions to sort of build up the information you need to prescribe something. The the presumably there are certain things that you go, oh yeah, this takes me into this list of potential remedies, and other remedies themselves natural products. They're not synthetically made by branches of big pharma on the side, that sort of thing.
I was
You
just
mentioned that.
laughing. I was just laughing because you'd make a brilliant homeopath. The fact that this is exactly what I teach my students. It's like if you're thinking about a remedy as you're, recording, because the first time you see someone, it's like a survey. You're just taking down information. But of course,
Mm.
because of your knowledge or your experience, you're going to be thinking exactly what you've just said. Oh, that could be that remedy. And so I say, just jot it down in the margin and be thinking. So yeah, the conversation will take you into, um, if you like, a space which has certain groups of remedies in it. And it may also be that when you look at the course of someone's life, you look at we I often try to teach my students to take the timeline to really look at how we arrived at the point we're at today. And I know I mentioned that earlier, but we'll be thinking about the point at which things began to change and what that signifies. Because the body only really does what it knows. So if you reach a crossroads and something happens to you, your body will manifest what is in your genetics, in your bloodline. It won't really suddenly do somebody else's.
Mm.
The only time I really see that is if a woman manifests a new symptom in pregnancy. Say she's never had, sinus issues or lung issues in her life, and then she's carrying a baby from a partner who has those lung issues.
Right.
She may manifest, so it's like an acquired state. Yeah, so that's the only time I really see that. Most of the time, people will say not be well resourced minerally, and they will move into a state like osteopenia, which is thinning bones. And then I'm like, does anyone else have this in your family? Sure enough, they do. The next
Right.
person, they will with a bit below par might move into having thyroid issues. I'm like, does anyone else in your family have this? Oh yeah, my sister, my aunt, my granny. A classic case the other day, I took a case and it was like there were three different people in the family with asthma, really quite chronic asthma. So no surprises that her kiddies are doing lung diseases rather than anything
Right.
else. So the body kind of like does what it knows, and in that sense, our remedies are grouped into family history groups. And then they might be grouped into, we might talk about them in terms of where they've come from. So many of our remedies come from plants, some of our remedies come from minerals, some of our remedies might come from animal product. And that kind of, you're like, oh, what do you mean by that? So we might take the venom of a snake or the sting of
Mm.
a bee, diluted many, many times to create this remedy. So there's no material substance left. And you might be like, well, you're the same as Big Pharma then. You're using rats, you're using, whatever you're using. But the truth of it is that we've taken the venom from one snake. That snake may not necessarily have been killed. And that snake has given up one shot of venom for like all the remedy in the world that was made from that because of the dilution.
Mm.
So we don't have to rape the earth in order to arrive at a healing solution. And that's one of my things that I feel like we complementary health practitioners need to share and talk about much, much more often. That, this is not like big pharma. This is not using massive resources. People will be like, oh, you put it on sugar pills. Where do they come from? Yeah, you can get organic sucrose pills. Equally, it could be a liquid that you drop into your glass of water. We can get really minimal. Sometimes I have Middle Eastern clients who don't want to take anything that has been used in alcohol, so they're
Mm.
really, really strict. Although most Middle Eastern medics, Muslim medics would say that you can just put it's fine to take it in a medical form. Alcohol used in medicine is considered to be
A big
different.
bottle of whiskey. Take it with
Exactly.
one drop and a big bottle of whiskey. As long as it's medical whiskey, you'll be
Yeah,
all right. Know what I mean? Let me ask you a question
exactly.
then.
So
That
yeah.
that GPs are always, it seems to me, never ask when you go in and you see a
Mm-hmm.
practitioner, and they never ask you about your diet and what you've eaten, unless you are grossly overweight or incredibly thin.
Mm-hmm.
How does I mean? Presumably, I'm assuming now that you would be interested in somebody's diet because you're going to give them something. But if, like you said before, you're a bit of a sugar addict and you're eating tons of sugar, that's going to affect the reaction that this minuscule molecule or whatever is going to do, presumably.
There are very, very few things that would completely antidote the effect of remedies. So it's considered that two or three of the essential oils, and drinking a lot of coffee would antidote the effect of the remedies. So they're really quite robust. We haven't really talked about flower essences, and we don't need to. But again, they're robust. They can both types of medicine can be used alongside other
Right.
mainstream
Oh,
medicine
okay.
choices. And usually, what happens, and this is wonderful, is you're prescribing for somebody, and you might be conscious they're a bit of a sugar addict or alcohol or cigarettes or something like that, and they'll come in and they'll say, I really haven't wanted to drink as much, or I found I just haven't wanted to eat that food stuff. And I may also give dietary advice because our food is incredibly denatured and
Well,
demineralized.
I suppose that's what I was really sort of fishing for was the dietary advice, because if people come in and they're eating wrong foods, that's going to make them ill as it anyway.
Yeah,
And just correcting your diet and not having highly processed food every day might be, in and of itself a cure or a remedy, so that it
totally.
just sets them back on a path. And then if they've still got those aches or whatever it is, the homeopathy is going to work even better, presumably, because your body is not being constantly poisoned by unnecessary chemicals.
Yeah, definitely. I One of my earliest lectures I remember going to, I don't think I was even training at the time, officially. And I just remember the woman, Dorothy Wallstein, she shared that she'd prescribed a remedy for somebody with ulcerative colitis, and they did very well. And then she
What
saw
what
that,
is what is that? Whatever it
oh,
was you've just
it's
described, or it's
ulcerative
just
colitis is basically bleeding out of your
oh,
intestines. Really, really horrible, painful. Not, yeah, not
not
not a
nice.
great situation to be in at
No,
all.
no, no.
But the remedy was curative for that condition, and the person did very
Wow.
well. But she didn't talk to them about diet, and they continued to went back to or continued to eat the kind of food that they were used to. And she saw them several years later, and how are you doing? And they'd had a section of the bowel removed because, and that for her was a really salient lesson that this homeopathy is amazing, but we need this holistic health approach. And
Mm.
many people, like, we can, when you eat processed food, it's like there are some drugs in there because you want more. I don't know if you've ever eaten Pringles, but they're kind of weird. You eat a few and you're like, oh, just have a few more. I mean, they're just dangerous. I don't know what's in
Mm.
them. They're
Mm.
laced with something, I'm sure.
Just in case any manufacturers of Pringles are coming, we're not
Yeah,
suggesting that you
yeah,
don't sell them or make well, people can make their informed decisions. So just
exactly,
please don't
exactly.
libel me for that. One has to be so
But
careful.
yeah, I know.
Um,
But I could list loads of things that I just think, oh yeah, I'll just have another one of those. But I know it's not great food for me. But usually, what I wanted to say about that, to use that as an example, is your body is hunting for the nutrition, and if
mm,
you're feeding it a lot of processed food, it will keep hunting for the nutrition that it needs to function.
because it's not
And so,
satisfied.
exactly, so you need to eat macro, which is not necessarily very good for us. If we started to talk about superfoods or sort of potent foods, then usually we need to eat much less of them. So we get a lot of energy in a small space, for instance, from some of these micronutrients, these superfoods. And so, you'll hear people, oh, I really rely on this, and that will help you. I mean, absolutely, that things like that can help support your immunity through the winter. So eating plenty of vitamin B rich foods, vitamin D rich foods, vitamin C, perhaps taking a supplement, as long as you read the label and check out a few of the things on it, because the supplement market, to be honest, generally is almost as bad as big pharma. If you're just buying from certain sources
Mm.
and not really looking at what's in it, you might find you're not doing your gut any favors. So I'm a bit of a stickler for the quality of supplements that people take, but I do see a need for them.
The thing
Um,
that I mean, just on
mm,
food for a moment, is that I often am talking about the we go to a farm shop and we try and eat as
mm.
much non-supermarket food. In fact, I haven't been into a supermarket for about 3 or 4 months now, and I'm very proud of that because
Me too.
I just don't. Mainly, I don't like the photo surveillance of going in and knowing what you've bought and all of that. But but also the food quality, of course. And then people will say, but where do you go? And you say, well, go to farm shops or to the farms themselves and other outlets. And they said, but isn't that too expensive for you? And I go, well, actually, I find I don't need to eat as much because, as you just so well put, that actually because you're eating quality food, you're not having to hunt for it by consuming too much more. Going, oh, well, when am I actually going to get satisfied with all this stuff? Other than that horrible bloating feeling that you get after you've eaten something wrong, and you go, oh God, I now wish I hadn't eaten it. Which is only 20 minutes after you had eaten it when you were desperate for it. And it's funny how the brain
Yeah,
attacks you there. So presumably, looking at just doing basic stuff before any sort of adjustment is obviously an idea. In terms of the normal things of just going for a walk or getting some level of fitness and stuff before you sort of instantly just go, there's always a remedy and I don't have to change my lifestyle.
totally. I think that again, I think you'd make a great homeopath. There's just because, you do I do get clients who come to me, kind of pill for every ill. And I'm like, actually, you're really shying away from something that fundamentally needs to change here. And that might be, regular exercise, mixing with other people, um,
Daylight.
get daylight. Exactly. If you want to get to sleep well, and I haven't done it this morning because I've been busy, but a couple of hours out in the weather.
Mm. And
But
and not too much time. I mean, I spend too much time. I know I do. And more time than ever on the path of freedom, truth, and health that I've been
yeah,
doing. More time than ever under blimmin' LED lights. There's the
totally.
irony for me, because prior to that, I was walking out in the countryside making heritage videos and landscape and nature videos. And so, in order to do the pursuit of interviewing wonderful people like yourself, I've ended up inside the studio. But I do go out and do as much walking and getting outside and getting all
Mm.
of that, all the good stuff. Bit of the nanotechnology that they're spraying the skies with. I do like to inhale as much of that as possible. Um, so how do?
But I'm with you. I just on that. I think that's I want to come back and say absolutely. I'm the same. I spend far too much time indoors on my laptop in the pursuit of trying to spread the truth about health or gems about health or whatever. So you have to factor in that those times away from it, don't
Mm.
you?
It's all
Yeah,
too easy to get drawn in because you can achieve quite a lot very quickly, and you
yeah.
think, oh well, another hour, I'll just get another 20 emails done, and actually, then you feel even more tired and you're not sleeping well. When people come to a homeopath and they get a remedy, what sort of time scale does a remedy? I mean, I'm sure this is very different for every, obviously, but if you go to a GP, and I'm obviously comparing it with the old system, let's say, or the established system, but when I say established, I should say it's only been like 100 years they've been established. Prior to that, you had the wise woman of the village who would tell you to go and have a bit of whistle snort or something, if you can find it, or one of these
You
wonderful
can find it
herbals
these
and
days.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but what sort of? I mean, they'll prescribe you something, and hopefully, within that, if as long as you take the course on that antibiotics or stuff, within a couple of days, whatever it was, has sort of cleared up. Is it the same? Is it quicker, or do these sometimes they just take longer, but they're better because they're slower with homeopathy?
It's a great question, and I think I would say ultimately, generally really varied. The first thing I have to come back with though is really that homeopathy is actually around 250 years old, and
Yes.
it's that kind of event in 2005 wasn't the first time that homeopathy has been routinely tried to be stamped out by physics and
Yes.
big pharma for a very, very long time. And it's a continual battle. And then, one country will say, "Oh, we're not allowing it," and another country will say, "Actually, we are." So yeah, interesting.
Mm.
Can't put a good something or
No,
other down. But
pseudo established, the one that is
yeah,
the big,
yeah.
yeah. But
But to come back to your question, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes people will take a remedy, and I have a wonderful client. She says, "I just breathe a sigh of relief every time I take one." She said, "I can just feel it's really good for me," and that's the kind of prescribing for long-term chronic conditions. And so, in that situation, somebody may need to take a remedy for a period of time because we're trying to um, reduce a pathology, something, a new tissue, a change in tissue. And so that might take a little bit more work, although sometimes these, people surprise you and you're like, "Oh, really? It went that fast? Wow, okay." um, and other times, yeah, it might take longer. So a kind of rough rule of thumb is, if you've had something going wrong for about 8 years and you finally arrived at the homeopath store, chances are it's going to take around 8 months of prescribing to right that. A kind of month for every year would be a very rough way of looking at it. And it can help you with prognosis for the client. How long do I need to take these remedies
mm,
for? What can you offer me? We need to, prognosis is a skill that all physicians, whatever your heritage is, need to learn to do. It's not something that you just know immediately. And
mm.
so, from taking that timeline, in that case, so for instance, I have a client who sees me who has a history of anorexia. Now, that means that she went through a long period of her life, about around 6 years, where she was completely depleted in nutrients, really underweight, really unhappy. And so it's a much harder job for me to help her return to full health than it is somebody who has had, for instance, some traumas or issues that they're working with, but they've had a relatively good diet for the whole of their life.
Yes.
That, and people say this at the moment. That being said, I keep hearing people say that. That being said,
That being said,
it's one of those phrases we use at the
oh
moment.
yes.
But that being said, if you have a weak constitution at birth, you can strengthen it using targeted foods and making healthier choices in your life. You can build on a weak constitution. Equally, you can weaken a strong constitution. And there are many reasons why we do that. There sometimes we're,
Sorry,
addicted
did you
to.
say you'd weaken a strong
Yeah,
constitution?
yeah,
Right.
yeah. So I think I did, in my 20s, I think I probably had a pretty good stab at weakening a relatively strong constitution, by not eating particularly well, by drinking
Oh, see, you're
snake
not doing it
bites at
you're not
college.
doing
I
yes,
wasn't doing it deliberately, but I had to do
but
quite a lot of
lifestyle, yeah.
rebuilding afterwards to get to a point now where I just feel like probably fitter than I was in my 20s,
Yeah.
and that's I think that's interesting, isn't it? When you
Mm.
you observe you're capable of observing your own pattern.
It
And
certainly said. I mean, I'm meeting people all the time who are telling me exactly that, and they're in
mm,
their 50s and 60s, and they say I'm feeling fitter than I was in my 20s
yeah,
and 30s because suddenly
great.
they've taken their life a bit more seriously,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not just sort of burning the candle and stuff. What about children? Is homeopathy good for children?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's how I got into it. And I think, contemporary parenting, there are a lot more issues than there were 35 years ago when I first had children, for all sorts of reasons.
Mm.
And it, again, I sort of mentioned it earlier, really, that we have this idea, this delusion as contemporary parents, that we are always going to be ill and we are always going to be tired. What is underneath that is an undernourished general state, and also, as we've just talked about, maybe an imbalanced lifestyle about how much time we do spend outside and
Mm.
indoors, etc. Plus, we are giving our children at this time of year, we're giving them um, routinely vaccines which are live nosodes. They're live virus rather. So if we're putting that into the general population is going to be exposed to that live virus and and start to manifest disease. So we do need to look at that. Like years and years ago, we used to give live polio vaccine to out in this country. It's the one that you used to get on the sugar cube.
Mm.
And now we give the dead cell vaccine. So that has a completely different effect in the population. So it kind of, we're talking about much, much cruder, or even though a vaccine is a diluted disease substance, it's nothing like as diluted as homeopathy. So people sometimes make that comparison, which to my mind is erroneous. But we are dishing out stuff routinely and not really questioning the consequences of that.
Yes.
So
And I think
yeah,
people now are slow. I mean, what with the recent events and stuff, people are beginning to think, hang on, what am I actually going to put into my body or my children's body?
yeah.
And people are perhaps a bit nervous. Do you find people are nervous of the homeopathy approach?
Well, generally speak, it's kind of interesting actually being a practitioner because, and I think probably most other types of complementary health practitioners would say similar. People walk in saying, I'd like to see a homeopath. They've walked through the door, and they're going to spend an hour with me, and we're going to talk about their health. So for them to be doubting and questioning at the end of that,
Mm.
consultation always strikes me as quite odd, but it does actually happen. And I think it's great when I get somebody who does ask a lot of questions because I always think, well, they're going to make somebody who is inquiring about other aspects of their health and actually going to get there much faster than somebody who's just accepting of everything that comes their way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's quite interesting to have someone in who doesn't really know much about the process and to understand that an awful lot of this for complementary health practitioners is education. The first time I went to see a homeopath, a friend said, oh, this was years ago, actually. I'd forgotten about this. So, although I got into homeopathy through my son, I did actually go and see a homeopath prior to that, probably 3 years prior. And a friend had been to see a homeopath, and I went to see her. And she just sort of asked me all these questions, but didn't really explain much about what she was doing. And so I was kind of a bit mystified. And I think that is a very old school approach, and I encourage people to try to educate their clients because people want to know,
Mm.
they and it's very easy to know how to once you've so also I talked about pattern. So when most people say somebody gets a headache and I say, okay, how is the headache for you? When does it occur? Is there anything that brings the headache on? Where in your head does it occur? How long does it last? Is there anything that makes it feel better or worse? And so I then build up a picture of how that headache is for that person. And I'm like, okay, well, when you next feel like you're getting a headache, try taking this remedy and take it every hour during the headache because it's a severe headache and we're trying to
Mm.
match that intensity of the situation, yeah, with a frequent prescription.
Mm.
So then the person is taking back a sense of control
Mm.
about with a natural health solution about their process. And normally what happens is they'll be like, wow, that headache didn't last as long as it normally does. Or maybe that headache didn't really even take hold like it normally does. So that kind of comes back to your earlier question about how long might you be taking remedies for. So the other thing that happens is headache is painful and it debilitates you. So normally what happens is somebody would say, not only did that headache not last as long, it was less severe.
Right.
And then with time, they'll come back to see you in a couple of months and you'll be like, so how many headaches have you had since I last saw you? Well, I haven't been getting them as often. So we see three things happen, not as intense, not as often, and not lasting as long. And then you know that the choice that you've made and the solution that you've got in your hand is working for you. And chances are you won't really need to ask many more questions about that headache, either as the person who's experiencing it or the practitioner, because you've got a solution, and
Yes.
over time they're gradually reducing.
It seems that one of the things that having the choice of different holistic practitioners to go to, and then the conversation that you're having is putting back the control, putting back the choice in the patient, rather than when you go to that mysterious GP who seems to have all the answers and you just get this pill and you've only got a few minutes to go in there. This must be so much more reassuring for patients, because they can hear the various options that you're giving them, and you're not saying, well, it's this or nothing, take this antibiotics, it'll be 7 days, make sure you finish it, blah, 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 and then come back if it hasn't worked, oh, actually, my foot dropped off by then. Giving the patient the control and the reassurance that they are the ones really who have got the control of this, rather than the doctor.
Yeah, and it's not
Is
only it's not only reassuring. I think it's rewarding for
Yeah,
the investment that you're both making, as patient and practitioner. And the other thing, that is really important to talk about is that all mainstream medication, if even the skin stuff, like a E45 cream, has some kind of unwanted action. And
side
that's,
effects.
yeah, exactly. And I prefer to talk about it as unwanted action, because it will have an action. It
Mm.
will, mainstream medicine will stop something happening or block an action or enhance an action in the body, but it will come with all sorts of other attendant things. And when that happens, particularly if you're taking it for a long period of time, there will be a scale of these actions that are going on, and the doctor will say to you, well, things like your sleep being off since you've had it, or a bit of joint aches and pain since you've been had it taking this medication, or some joint aches and pain since you've been having it. Those are kind of like mild to moderate actions, and I'm going to ignore them. And your body will start to shout louder after a time and say, I really need something for my sleep now. And the
Mm.
doctor will say, well, yeah, have sleep medication as well. So then
Which also comes with its
it's exactly its own
side
actions.
effects. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. So then I get my poor clients come in sometimes, often these things start in the 50s, maybe 60s, as the body loses the capacity to do certain enzymatic reactions or actions that it needs to function. So something like CoQ10, we lose the capacity to create this very effective antioxidant. Um, we lose the
CoQ10
CoQ10, it's called. So we lose the
sounds like the hokey
capacity.
pokey.
It does, doesn't it?
Got a bit of the
Well,
old CoQ10 here.
no, and it does exactly that. It does the Koki. What it does is it fires up the little mitochondria inside all of your cells. So yeah, it is involved in energy action, and without it, you might feel tired or depleted, and etc. etc. So things like that become harder for us when we're over the age of around 50, and so that's a point in time where many women and men start to take a form of medication. They might get high blood pressure. And then it's
Right.
like, oh, on this medication, you also need to take that one. So suddenly you're on two high blood pressure tablets, and you might then need something for your sleep. And so people come in, on a cocktail of medication,
Yeah.
and a dispiriting downward spiral of their health. And so that can be quite a lot, quite a long journey to claw somebody back from. And
Do you see?
so
Do you see a lot of people who are sort of they're on a load of stuff like this, and they're now quite desperate because if they're fearful of going to the GP, that they'll just get another thing added to the list. Well, you've got to take all these for your liver, for your brain, for your sleep, for your joints. Oh, and what's the problem now? Your tongue's going blue, right? Okay, you better take this one then for the. And in the end, they've got so many different things. And do they come to you as a sort of last resort, going, "Help! I don't want to keep taking any more of this rubbish."
Sadly, yes. And
Yes.
often it is a rash, that's
Right.
finally their bodies started to kind of itch and become a bit abhorrent, and it will be that drives them to the homeopaths, because most otherwise they'll be asking questions beforehand. It's like it's 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 a hard task, on both
So really,
sides.
people should be coming to their homeopath much earlier on, and ignore these doctors who are trying to give them big pharma. We've run out of my hour slot. Unfortunately, I can see that we could talk for ages. Where can people? Well, I'm going to put a link to your website. You do other things. I know you mentioned about. We didn't talk about that, and we haven't really got time now. But the flower essence stuff. In a nutshell, what does that mean? What is that? What does that do?
Yeah, so flower essences are in a way quite similar to homeopathy. They're prepared in a different way. So yeah, without kind of meandering too much, but I might use them alongside my homeopathic prescribing. Yeah, we can talk about that another time. But yeah,
And
so
do you do
mhm,
courses as well? I think I
yeah,
saw on your website.
yeah. And I was just about to say that I do courses and workshops, and I love
Here we
to
go.
do a simple thank you, introduction to to homeopathy for people, so that they can get to know how to use a first aid kit at home, etc. So yeah,
So there you go. So I'll put a
thank you.
link in the description to all of that, so people can go and have a look at that and see. And if you've never been to a homeopath, go and try it. See what occurs. Spoke to a lady only the other day, actually, in Hertfordshire, who gave us breakfast. Actually, a lovely lady, and she said that that's what she did. She was a homeopath, and I said, "Well, I've got a lady coming on the show. Are they mostly ladies that do homeopathy?"
Yes, I think the vast majority of practitioners are. We always joke about a slightly inverse proportion of a lot of teachers are male.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, there you go. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've got something out of that. It's been fascinating for me. More and more of this alternative health is springing up all over the place, and hubs of people doing all this stuff, which is fantastic to see. And I imagine you see people, Caroline, at home and/or on Zoom and places like that.
Yeah, vast majority of my work at the moment is online and Zoom,
Yeah,
because
under artificial light,
yeah,
and in front of
I
screens.
think
But if it,
people are time poor. That's why
yes,
it works for a lot of people. It's just like, oh, can we do it in Zoom? And it's, yeah, I
yeah.
do. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time and coming on the show and telling us about it. I really appreciate that. The links will be in the description. It's a fascinating area. So there we go. Another. That was no one's come and talked about that on the show before. So you're the first on that, which is fantastic. I'll probably get a list of people going, "Oh, well, can I come on now and talk about it?" But brilliant stuff, and more power to you, Caroline. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I will be back with more monologues and more wonderful interviews, of course, so stay tuned. But until next time, thanks for watching from Caroline and I. Goodbye.